Yeah, my name is Barry Guihen, and as you heard, I'm with the University of Central Lancashire. But prior to that, I worked on a project called Value Aging. And what I want to do today is kind of give a bit of context when we talk about technology assessment, technology governance, and use aging in place as a kind of a way to look at what do we mean by governing technologies or assessing the impact of these technologies. And it's only got 15 minutes. So I'll only be able to give kind of a brief overview or a kind of a general idea of what aging in place in Europe means and what aging means. So I'm going to get on with it. So the Value Aging project was a 4-year project with partners across Europe, and the goal was to examine the ethical implications of the digital society for older people in Europe. The digital agenda is huge in Europe at the moment, and it's all to do with e-inclusion, e-accessibility. But there's also the danger that as we become more technologically savvy, as we lean on technologies and use them to empower people, you also risk excluding other groups, and often it's vulnerable groups, and in this case we looked specifically at aging. Outside of that, there was also the goal to enhance communication between commercial and non-commercial partners, so universities and kind of non-commercial research centres, and also kind of include engineering firms and commercial research centres as well, and get them kind of talking. And as part of that, we did there were secondments of different researchers and employees across the different institutions. So this work, although I was employed by CSSC in Rome, this work was mainly carried out in Tecnalia in Spain. So I should say as well, yeah, it was a 4-year project, as I said, 9 partners and 7 countries, so it was quite a bit across Europe. So what do we mean when we talk about aging in Europe, and why do we talk about it in general? Well, for RRI, it's important because it's one of the pillars, one of these 6 grand challenges that's being kind of the focus of RRI in Europe at the moment. It's health, demographic change, and well-being. And because of this, it's really going to receive even more attention in the coming years. And it's partly because, well, by 2030, we're looking at almost a quarter of the population of Europe being over 65. So as a population, as a society, as a community, we're aging. And it's something that's only becoming more pressing as time goes on. Apart from that, well, what does aging mean? It means that there's changing needs in society, and we need to reflect on how, as a society, we address them. And this can be everything from the fact that, as you age, people experience kind of difficulties cognitively, physically. Here you see in 2010, it's estimated that 36 million people globally have dementia. By 2050, it's projected to be 115 million. And that's just one example. At the same time, however, it's dangerous to talk about aging as a problem. You don't want to say the population is aging and that's bad, because aging is universal. We're all hopefully going to age. But aging in context is not. So what we need to do is, instead of saying, population is bad, well, actually, no, it's great, it's natural. But there are challenges that we need to address as part of that. And, it's very, very dangerous, because when you talk about, these challenges associated with aging, you have to watch your language, because the very people you're trying to help and support and empower and enhance independence, when you talk about population aging as a problem, well, you risk stigmatizing the very people you're trying to help and, excluding them from a conversation that really is all about them. And I think this is why you have to be so careful with this language. So the home in Europe then, I'm talking specifically about aging in place. And aging in place is about empowering people to choose to live in their homes for as long as possible, and meeting their needs, whether physically, cognitively, socially, emotionally. Someone I interviewed suggested their spiritual needs. Meeting all of these needs to enhance their independence and allow them to live in their homes. And in Europe, a home can mean many, many different things. I grew up in a house, in a garden. That's actually my house, top left. And that's my experience of what a home is. But, I have other pictures here from Budapest, from Spain, from Finland, and they're all very, very different. Some people grow up in apartments, some grow up in houses as part of urban environments. And as also you have to remember that these are just pictures of bricks and mortar and glass. And when you talk about the home, part of it is the building, but the other part of it is the network and the memories and the social connections and the personal connections that people build inside these homes. And when you talk about supporting people to stay in their homes, it's not just about making a house fit for purpose. It's also about ensuring that home remains home. And this is one of the things I'll talk about in a second, but one of the real difficulties with adapting an environment or providing care for people in their homes is that you have to remember that it's not a hospital. It's, this is something that was not a place for medical care in the past, potentially. And when you introduce it, it has to be in a way that's holistic and comfortable and acceptable to the people that we're talking about. So yeah, it can be a shack or a palace, but it doesn't matter. You have to come at it from the, if you're dealing with an individual, you have to come at it from their perspective. If you're dealing at it from a societal level, you have to remember that supporting aging in place is a universal goal, maybe, but it is met by very, very different ways depending on the different contexts that you're talking about, and that means individually, culturally, socially. So yeah, feeding into the challenges of supporting aging in place. I mean, it might sound obvious, but the first place you should always start with, is what's your goal? The goal here is to enable older people to choose. Do they want to remain in place? Maybe they don't. Maybe they want to go to a care home, or they want to be in a place where there's a more focused community. Some people don't want to age in their homes. And it might sound obvious to start with, well, what's our objective? But I think even for talking about TA and technology governance in general, I mean, it's an important question, because for this, it's, well, do you want to build a very slick, smart home with a fancy robot butler, or do you want to empower older people? And maybe one meets the other, but at the same time, those two questions, they bring you to different places, and the temptation sometimes is to slip away from the needs that you're trying to address and focus too much on the innovations that you're trying to impress with. So, yeah, hang on a second. Yeah, so supporting aging in place specifically, it involves, as I said, intervening in the home, potentially the collection or the transmission of personal data, including health data, from the home to a place off-site, potentially a hospital or a GP. These are very sensitive issues, that have very complex legal and ethical implications. As I said, it's also about identifying the particular context, culturally or socially, of aging and the home. So, for example, in some countries, aging and older people and the home in general, it's not just the nuclear family, it's not just parents and children, it's also many, many generations in one home. And maybe that has a different implication for their expectations of what aging is, or the needs that they need to meet, as people age. And one of the things, especially with regards to emerging technologies, is developing best practices, identifying best practices, developing norms, and looking not just at their development and the phases of development, but also their implementation and the legacy of these technologies as well. One of the things about smart homes is that technology can be developed and it can be cutting edge, and in 5 years it's obsolete. But then if you're trying to update a smart home for somebody, what's the cost of replacing or upgrading that house? Are you stuck in one time once you've implemented the technology? Also, the aging isn't static. The needs of a person will change as they age. Potentially it starts with visual impairment, but over time, perhaps dementia or Alzheimer's becomes a greater need that needs to be addressed. So these solutions need to be flexible, and they need to be adaptable to the specific needs of the individual. At a societal or at a broader level, a policy level, this means that you have to have frameworks that allow for flexibility, funding that allows for that kind of movement for changing for these changing needs as time goes on. So yeah, exactly. Producing, I'm ahead of my slides a little bit, but producing solutions that are flexible and adapting to changing needs and capabilities. So when I talk about emerging technologies in the context of aging in place, I've just decided to throw up some pictures. I could have had 100 pictures, but I tried to get a kind of a representative sample and just kind of, when you talk about smart homes, I mean, my first thought before I started was robots and, very fancy sensors. And there are some of those. You see the robot at the bottom left. But the two top ones I want to draw your attention to, one of them is just a bathroom. But actually it's a bathroom that's been adapted to allow for a wheelchair. The second one is hardly high technology. It's a ramp and a handrail. But these technologies and these innovations, they can be just as vital as a wall sensor that detects whether a person is in a room or not. And sometimes you don't need a huge amount of technology. You just need a handrail. And that has to be recognized as well. Also, some of these smart home technologies are just general control of an environment. The middle left is a Nest thermostat, which is an internet-connected thermostat that you can operate from a smartphone, similar to the Lockitron, the internet-controlled or app-controlled lock. These are not necessarily technologies specific to aging, but they do enhance control over an environment and maybe have a role to play. Others are, you can see also adjustable countertops. potentially for people who over time may need a wheelchair, etc. And also then in the middle you have an example of a telehealth device, which is used to collect and transmit health data from the user to the doctor. And I think this is really important when we talk about smart homes and when we talk about the technologies we involve. Like a smart home is not a technology in itself. It's an amalgamation of a collection of technologies. And when we talk about what that means for the user, well, it means that each person will have a different idea of the smart home, or will have a different kind of configuration of a smart home that suits their needs best. And this is one of the reasons that I felt that aging in place was really a good place to talk, or a good context for talking about technology assessment and technology governance, because it is a combination of emerging and established technologies and also other disciplines like architecture and social science. And this is really, when we talk about technology governance enhancing ORI, I think this is what we need to look at, looking at bringing in stakeholders that may not initially be obvious. So when we talk about social innovation, because this is the other aspect, is that it's not all about technology. Well, what does this mean for aging in place? Well, first of all, specific to aging in place, it means that you recognize, again, going back to that idea of a home being more than just bricks and mortar and glass, you recognize the role of caregivers. And these can be nurses, these can be doctors, these can be professional carers, but they can also be family members, they can also be neighbors. And in the report that we did for value aging, the term we used for this was a Greek one. It was oikos. And it's a word that recognizes kind of the different social connections that you build up around a house. And I think when we look at trying to allow for not just aging in place, but supporting older people in general, or vulnerable people in general, it's important to look outside the assumed kind of formal networks that you have, and look at the specific contexts and the specific relationships that, again, may not initially be obvious. And also recognizing that maybe supporting the needs of, again, in aging in place, the needs of the older person, sometimes that also means addressing the needs of carers, or addressing the needs of family, because they, in their role of support, may need some too. And this could be financial, it could be community, it could be many, many things. But you also always have to have a very open idea of the stakeholders that are involved. And again, it's this idea of focusing on who rather than what. It's going back to that idea of, are you trying to empower someone, or are you trying to build a fancy technology, or create an innovation because you want to create an innovation? Again, I've said it before, and it's just worth stressing this cultural context of aging in place, including regional standards and their models of care. In another report that we did for value aging, we part of what we did was we were looking at attitudes of aging across Europe. And it actually varies quite a bit, depending on the country, depending on the culture. And in some places, it's not thought of at all. It's not an issue. In others, there's a bit of a stigma around aging, and they don't really feel comfortable talking about what happens as you get older, or older people in society. And there are a variety of reasons for this. But these are all things that you have to take into account, because you can build all of these technologies, or you can develop these social frameworks, but they still need to be not only acceptable to society, but they have to be built with an awareness that they have to be part of that society. So yeah, this is another point, is that in Europe we have our fundamental values, and they're great. I mean, it's great because it's always a good starting point. We respect for privacy or security, but what does that mean in practice? And the one I always come back to is dignity. What do we mean when we say we respect people's dignity? And it will vary depending on the project, depending on the goal. But you always have to, I feel, especially with addressing these grand challenges in RRI, you always have to be aware of the values that you're using, but how they're expressed in real terms, whether it's in how you develop your technology or how you implement a social program. So here I just wanted to throw up the kind of formal context of what aging is in Europe. Thank you. And kind of give an overview of what is going on in terms of policy. And so I just thought it was best to kind of give a broad overview. It's by no means comprehensive. I include the Riga Declaration, which was published in, I think, 2006. It was to do with ICT for an inclusive society. It was a good starting point. It specifically mentions aging. The Digital Agenda for Europe also mentions aging and inclusiveness. I put in the Rome Declaration on ORI in Europe. It doesn't talk about aging specifically, but I thought it was appropriate, and I'm quite optimistic in that it also recognizes vulnerable groups. In the EU, you have intergroups on aging and intergenerational solidarity. There's funding for projects and for groups such as Age Platform Europe, which is, again, about bringing stakeholders together and funding projects. The AALJP, which is, yeah, it's at the bottom, they are good for agenda setting and providing funding for SMEs specifically on different AAL ambient technologies related to supporting older people. So the EU can help with agenda setting, funding, providing those frameworks and support. I'm sure there's always more that can be done, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what is actually happening. And then to kind of wrap up with the challenges for aging in place, what are the challenges going forward? The proposed solutions, they have to be adaptable, as I've said. The ICT should never just be deployed because that's what you want to deploy. It should always be, as I said before, your goal should be to really start with your needs, I feel, and then move into, well, how do we support that? Is technology appropriate? Is it not? And that's not by any means to suggest that technology is not appropriate or to say that we should start socially and then see about technology, but it's just that we should start with looking at what we want to achieve before we rush in with our innovations. And on a more technical level, and I suppose a normative level, our standards and cooperation, they should be promoted to ensure that what we produce in Ireland is workable in Estonia or in Hungary or in Italy. There's value to national developments, but if, again, at a European context, it's all good if we're working off the same hymn sheet. And we should always be aware of the needs that maybe could or should be addressed. And I mean, you can legislate for privacy, there are frameworks for technology, but how do you legislate for loneliness? Like, how do you do that at a structural level? It's very, very difficult, and you can't always assume that you have all the answers. You should always be looking for other needs and other stakeholders, and this is why communication is so important. And finally, to wrap up, I kind of wanted to bring it back to a more general idea of ORI and what do I think that we can learn from case studies like Aging in Place. Again, what is your goal? I think I've talked about that enough. Who are the stakeholders? And more importantly, or just as importantly, how are they communicating? How are these people, is it just once a year at a conference, or is it regularly? These are important questions. And is it is it just industry talking to itself, or is it non-commercial and commercial together? These are all things I think need to know and need to promote. And are there voices missing from the conversation? Again, with Aging in Place, it's looking at a potentially vulnerable group. And it's the same with a lot of the grand challenges. But are there voices maybe that you don't necessarily always hear? Are there people that you should be bringing into these conversations, to enhance it for everybody? Because again, just to go back to aging, everybody ages. But that can be many, many different things. So I kind of just wanted to close with those questions and, kind of see what you thought about that. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Barry, for this most interesting presentation. So now we have a little time to ask questions. Are there any questions here?
I have two questions actually. That's short. I was wondering whether through the project you came to meet the elders through your systems to use whatever ICT-based solutions. And the second question concerns the fact that population is aging, and associated to that comes higher costs, especially when it comes in the healthcare system. And some governments are relying on ICT to cut on costs, and so there is somehow a pressing financial force behind some this kind of government strategy, let's say. I was wondering whether you came across some studies or what your opinion is, because that really clashes with I think most of your stance for the adoption.
Okay, so the first was resistance to the technologies and the second was cost. Okay, so on the first point, yeah, absolutely. There are older people who are resistant to using these technologies for a variety of reasons. It can be everything from that they don't feel comfortable having sensors in their home to it's just inconvenient. Wearing a sensor every day, having to remember to put it on, that's a pain. I wouldn't, necessarily like to feel I have to wear a sensor every day. And it can be that they feel that their autonomy is, reduced, which is massively important. Or it can just be that simply they don't like it, And that's a legitimate reason. It's okay to not like something. And it's your job then to, first of all, communicate the value of your approach, whether it's technology or otherwise. And then after that, to listen and to see. And it's it's not always as easy as communicate and everything will be okay. But all you can do is try and communicate and try and work on the different stakeholders to reach an optimal solution. In terms of cost, I think especially health technology assessment has a huge focus on cost reduction. And it seems to be that there is this hope that, especially with the labor shortage, with the shortage of carers for older people in the future, that technology can take some of the burden. And I'm not sure. I'm not convinced. I think that it's more important that we have these kind of social innovations that are enhanced or amplified by technology. So, for example, one of the projects that we looked at, that I interviewed the director of this project called Echenondo in Spain, in the north of Spain, and it was kind of a community-based care program, so not necessarily aging in place, but one of the focuses was to retain the home-like quality of the space. So as people moved, they brought with them mementos, they brought with them parts of their home. And it saved costs in that, it was still centralized care. But it was socially innovative as well because it was community, it was, led by community efforts. And, it's a tough one in terms of cost, You hope that technology will be more accessible, but cost of development is very high.
Okay. So the first question was about pessimistic and optimistic views on new technologies and how that comes into the approaches from whom or so that was my first question. And the second is how do you include diverse groups into the research on the elder people? So I'm especially interested in gender and then different cultural contexts because we are discussing in Germany very much the different needs, if they are there, of immigrants, and that is especially on living in communities or living in 1-2-person homes, and that also interferes with gender. So I was interested in how you use that or how you go.
Okay.
Should I go first?
Yeah. What I meant when I say a spectrum between pessimistic and optimistic, these imaginaries, is that there are sort of storylines about what these technologies might achieve. Are those imaginaries, or are they those visions or ideas, are they something that we embrace or something we dislike? And depending on what technologies we're talking about, some are very optimistic, some are less so, and some are things that saying we don't want this.
Who's we? Yeah.
But that is, I mean, in terms of studying that, is sort of, you could say, where are these imaginaries articulated? Who are the actors that have ideas that try to engage with these technological developments? So, for instance, the GMO case I've been working on, you have technologists, biotech companies, etc., creating visions about all the problems that can be solved through GM technologies, and you have environmentalist technology skeptics who tell stories about all the bad things that might come out of GM technology. So these visions are articulated in public debates, but they also go into governance agencies. I mean, you have the EU Commission, they articulate ideas about, and some of them are very optimistic. There's some things we want to promote, so it's a promotional agenda, and some of them are saying, well, we don't want that, or at least we need to have an eye for what unfortunate consequences might come up. Surveillance, environmental devastation. I mean, you have, in the medical sort of genomics research, I mean, we can potentially clone a human being now. We don't want to do that, ever. And that's something that shouldn't just be regulated, that should be banned. Whereas there are other ways of using genetic knowledge that we consider beneficial. So what we're trying to, it's outlining a conceptual space where you can discuss how do these imaginaries play out in public debates or in institutions.
Okay, Barry?
So on kind of including all aspects of aging, it's very difficult. I mean, in Ireland, one of the problems that we have in rural Ireland especially is that there are a lot of older men living alone, unmarried men, and leads to high rates of suicide, etc. And each culture, each country will have its own special challenges, whether it's immigration, whether it's, you know, loneliness, isolation. On the part of value aging, what we did was, because it was such a big project, you know, it wasn't just on, the aging in place was just one part of it. You know, there was a whole other report on robotics in supporting older people. There was another report on corporate social responsibility. One on, we did scenario generation, and interestingly in the scenario generation, what the author did was he also included the perspective of what it's like to be aging in prison, for example. So, you know, we made efforts to kind of include kind of ideas outside of just an older person living in a house. And that involved, you know, interviewing people, community group leaders or policy makers, and getting also validation from policy makers, from industry, from others. But yeah, I don't know, does that answer your question? But yeah.
Okay. So I'm looking on my watch. Björn, will you go on?
Yeah, may I ask one question?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, do we have time?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. A friend of mine has told me the story. So he is, I'm living in Austria right now, and he is about the age of about 70. He's director of a museum, and he has 3 homes, one in Tyrol, one in Togo in Africa, and one in Thailand. And he is living 2 months there, 3 months there, 5 months there. And he said the worst case is Austria. Because when he is staying there, he has to go to bed at 10 o'clock in the evening because nobody talks to him. He's isolated. So I think integrating elderly people is a main thing, main topic. And did you include this into your research? Because if I understand right, this is more a technological solution, how to deal with the problem elderly people. And when I take into account the huge technology change in the last 20 years, we have to change how we deal with elderly people in the next 10 years again when technology has changed. So I think there are more problems.
Well, the report that this was based on was actually specifically psychological and social aspects, so the non-technological issues or challenges associated with supporting aging in place. And what we came up with were a set of conclusions and recommendations for policymakers and for technology producers, I suppose. These were things like loneliness, isolation, real and perceived security. But you're asking about the reliance on technology to solve these problems, is it? Yeah, that was one of the things that we recommended against, and it's something I said in the presentation, is that if you start with what the problem is first, and once you know what your problem is and what you want to achieve, then you start to look at the tools that you have, and that might be technology, or it could be a social change, or it could be a combination of the two. And again, about Austria, I mean, again, it comes back to that cultural context. In other parts of Europe, the family or the social context is very, very different.
Right.
And you have different problems. So even in a society that's very culturally or very social, maybe because you can't drive anymore, you can't make it 10 minutes down to go to your poker game or to go to the pub, for example. So I should. Yeah.
That was in Ireland.
Well, the study was done in Spain.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, fine.